want to share just a brief word with you, moms and dads and students, about just where the Lord has you, how He is working around you, how He chooses to work through each and every one of us, each and every day. I got to speak at a local high school this week, which I'm always thankful to do, and challenge those students to be intentional in what they are doing. To be intentional in the conversations they have, the relationships they build, to be intentional in how they approach their classwork, any kind of team or group they're a part of at school, to be intentional with it. And we could flesh that out, and we could look at literally hundreds of verses throughout Scripture that speak to believers being intentional with their lives. But today, I want to challenge you, like I challenged this group, and thinking about being intentional. Because in Scripture, when I think about being intentional, this is the passage that comes to mind I want to share with you today. It's out of Ecclesiastes 3, and that may be familiar to you, it may not, but I want to read a couple verses in it with the idea, and looking through the lens of being intentional. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "There is an occasion for everything, and a time for every activity under heaven. A time to give birth, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to throw stones, and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace, and a time to avoid embracing. A time to search, and a time to count as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What does a worker gain from his struggles? I have seen the task that God has given the children of Adam to keep them occupied. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts. But no one can discover the work of God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. I know that everything God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. God works so that people will be in awe of Him." And so when we hear that, and we hear how God has intentionally placed us in time, how God Himself says there is a certain time for certain things, and I love how in verse 11 He has made everything appropriate for its time, meaning that everything that has been put into motion on this planet is for a specific time, a specific thing. But when we think about for a second how intentional God is and how He has been intentional throughout history, we can start making a list. We can look at things in the Bible like creation, of how He was particular in how He ordered creation to be. We can look at things like Noah and the ark, when He gave him instructions on how to build the ark, what to build it out of, how to gather the animals, who's going to be on the ark. He was intentional with the instructions that He gave. We think about when He constructed the temple and how the temple was to be constructed, and the materials to be used and the measurements, and so detailed down to the smallest thing. But God was intentional in that. How we think about the 10 Commandments, and we have these 10 laws that other laws were drawn from, and to order our steps of life. How He was intentional in that. For the sole purpose of this, He loves us. And He is intentional about loving us. And He shows that ultimately through the intentionality of Jesus' life. How Jesus came born of a virgin in a stable. How He grew as a child, as a teenager, into a young adult, into His adulthood of living a life as a carpenter, and then coming and proclaiming Himself as Messiah to fulfill prophecy that was talked about. How He lived a sinless life, how even through His sacrifice and death on the cross, there was intentionality in each one of the steps that led there, and ultimately His death and resurrection. How God was intentional in the details of how all that would work. And it comes back to how God said he made everything appropriate in its time. Everything has a time and a season. There's a reason for everything. There's a reason that God has you where you are right now, moms and dads, in your job, in your family, students in the classes he has you in, on the teams you're on, in the groups, the clubs, maybe at school, wherever he has you. He's intentional and has you in your church, in your Sunday school or Bible study groups, as we come together to worship collectively, especially here at Denman. He's intentional in the people who are here, but how he draws you in, and knowing the message that he's going to have for you each and every Sunday through the songs that we sing, through every little detail. God is intentional, and pray that we can be a part and we can be intentional in how we carry that out. Because it poses a couple questions that I challenge students with this today is how are you being intentional? How are you being intentional? Look, sit back and try to get a big picture view of your day, of your week. How are you being intentional for Jesus? With your friends, whether they're believers or they don't know Jesus. How are you being intentional with your family? Students, with your mom, dads, grandparents, parents, how are you being intentional with your children in raising them up in the likeness of Jesus? And then we think about how are we being intentional? It should cause us to reflect on why is it important to be intentional? The biggest reason why it's important is it shows the world the purpose and that God has for each and every one of us. Ultimately, he loves us, and he desires for people to know that and come to know him. He was intentional in sending Jesus to sacrifice himself, to die, to be buried, and to rise again. He's intentional in having us where we are at this point in time because he has made everything appropriate in its time. So on days that we feel like, man, what are we doing? Or just like giving up and like I'm done with today. I'm done with my friends. I'm done with my family. When we get to that point, we need to remember that God has us where we are for a reason. And so when we think about how we can be intentional in those moments, how we can show people around us the love of Jesus and use those moments, like be aware of our time and our actions and our words in those moments to bring him glory. Well, it's a story that I shared with this group about, there was a Scottish evangelist, and his name was John Harper. And you may have heard of him. You may know this story. But John was invited to speak at Moody Bible Church in the early 1900s. Ended up staying for a couple months because of the Lord was moving through his teaching, and now we have Moody Bible College out of it, located in Chicago, and still training people to for ministry, and so. He had come there, and he'd just been received very well, and he got invited back a couple years later. Well, it's 1912. He and his sister and his daughter, which his wife had passed, so his sister was helping with his daughter, were traveling from Scotland to America. And they boarded a boat called the Titanic. And so we know what the end story was with the Titanic. But as the Titanic was starting to go down, Harper looked at his surroundings. He got his sister and his daughter loaded on a lifeboat, and he had a life jacket on, and he began just asking people, if you died right now, do you know where you'd spend eternity? He used his time intentionally to speak the gospel into people. And I don't know how many people heard the message and surrendered to Jesus that night. But as the story goes, he ended up in the water floating with a life vest, and he's still evangelizing to people. And he asked this one man, "Are you saved?" And he said, "I'm not." And he said, "Well, call in the name of the Lord and you will be saved." And then the next thing you know, he realizes, I'm not going to make it. And so he takes his life vest off and he throws it to somebody and says, "You need this more than me." And ultimately he drowns. His daughter and sister didn't hear that until they were rescued and got to America, and they found out that he had died that night. But a couple years later, they had a survivors reunion from the Titanic, and as they were going around sharing stories, this one man stood up and said, "I was John Harper's last convert. I realized I needed Jesus, and he told me about him with his dying breath." He was intentional with every moment he had. And so to me, that's encouragement. That's a shot in the arm of being more intentional with my words, being more intentional with my time, with my family, with my friends. And so I want to encourage you today, moms and dads, students, to be intentional where God has you right now. And as he moves you to the future, unless the Lord comes back, to be intentional where he's going to place you in your jobs, on your teams, in the classroom. And I hope that we can all do it in a way that brings glory to him. I pray you guys be faithful to the Lord, and I pray you guys have a great rest of the week.